initiative. A few years ago, we did set up a radiological health response team. I think it was back in 2017, 2018. And then other things took priority, and we did not get much off the ground. And so this team is going to do maybe some of the same things that that team was going to do, but we've got some very specific missions that we're looking for MRC volunteers to do. And this is specifically around responding in the event of an unlikely emergency for one of our nuclear power stations in Virginia. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt Ettinger, who is our Director, Environmental Monitoring and Emergency Preparedness Division. Matt, over to you.
All right, thanks, Mike. I'm going to try to share my screen here.
All right, we can see you're in slides, and now we see you in slideshow mode, so you're good to go.
Good to go. So as Mike said, my name is Matt Ettinger. I'm the Director of Environmental Monitoring and Emergency Preparedness for the Office of Radiological Health. Just to give you a real brief introduction, Office of Radiological Health is comprised of 3 divisions. We have our X-ray division, pretty self-explanatory what they do. We have our radioactive materials division. One of the things that's neat about that, we are an agreement state. So that means that we actually license and inspect owners, users of radiological materials in the Commonwealth of Virginia, running a program that is equal to or greater than the program that MRC would run if they were doing the inspections here. And then finally, there's my division, which is environmental monitoring and emergency preparedness. And then under that is also radon. Shameless plug, while I'm here, there's still 1 day left in January, or at least part of a day. January is National Radon Action Month. So if you haven't tested your homes for radon, it's a good thing to do, and you can get discount radon test kits on the VDH website. So that's my shameless plug for the guy that does radon for me. As Mike mentioned, the opportunities we're going to look at today are primarily focused around incidents involving one of the state's 2 nuclear power plants. To be perfectly honest, when I was first approached about these ideas or coming up with ideas for volunteer opportunities, I really didn't know that we had opportunities out there or gaps out there. But it's kind of one of those things where when you sit down and you start thinking about it, you realize you have a lot of gaps that you could fill if you just had individuals to do it. And so that's what kind of led to the 2 distinct response roles that we're going to talk about today. So this is just a slide showing the affected areas around the Surrey and the North Anna power plants, and then also the little bit of Virginia that is impacted by Calvert Cliffs, which is a power plant in Maryland. Inside the small circle inside each is the 10-mile circle, the 10-mile emergency planning zone around each power plant. And then the counties that are in stippling or have the little dots show the counties that are affected by that 10-mile ring. And then the bigger ring around each site is the 50-mile ingestion pathway zone around each of the power plants. And I just put that up to show you how much of the state is impacted by one of the 2 plants in Virginia or the plant in Maryland. So thought I'd start off with a real brief and generalized introduction to what's involved in a power plant emergency. There are different emergency classifications. These are a progression of events that occur at the power plants if they were to have an accident or incident. Each of these and the progression through each of these is really driven by the integrity of the fission product barriers that are in place at the plant. So there are 3 fission product barriers. There's the reactor coolant system, there's the fuel cladding, and then there's the containment, the domes that everyone knows themselves. And those are the 3 fission product barriers. And what we look for is a degradation at the plant that impacts one or more of those. And that kind of drives us through these different classification levels, especially when you talk about site area and general emergencies. I'm not going to read through everything that's up there. You can see this, and later on you'll be able to view the slides. The one thing to point out, and a lot of people don't know this, is that you can have a release of radiation from the plant at any of these classification levels. So most people think that you only have a release at the general emergency or the most severe accident type, but you can actually have a release at any point in the changing conditions at the plant. So speaking about just the state response to a nuclear power plant event, there's really 3 facilities that are stood up on the state side that drive the response efforts by the individuals that are tasked with responding to these types of incidents. So the first is our State Emergency Operations Center, or EOC. There's a lot of support functions that go on there, and those are basically driven by the different emergency support function groups that are there. So we have agriculture, we have VDOT, we have volunteers, we have law enforcement, a whole host of different ESFs that are going to provide support functions. And then the primary response in terms of the actual power plant event are driven by ESF 8, which is health, and in specifically within health, the Office of Radiological Health. And then our partners at the Virginia Department of Emergency Management really take the lead in this. The EOC is overall command and control of response efforts, and it is at the EOC that the state develops protective action recommendations. These are either evacuation, shelter in place, and then either one of those with or without the administration of potassium iodide. So that's kind of the general view of what's going on at the EOC. Then both the Office of Radiological Health and the Virginia Department of Emergency Management also send staff to Dominion Energy's corporate response or corporate emergency response center. This is the facility I like to go to if we're practicing an event, or where I probably would go if there was an actual incident. This is where you really get down into the nitty-gritty technical details of what's going on. And I'll show some pictures of this facility in just a minute. At this facility, you can view all of the systems at the plant. You can look at pressures, you can look at flow rates, you can look at radiation measurements coming off at different points in the plant. You can view whether the filters are in place or not. So there's a whole host of information and data that you can gather there. And it's also at this facility that they're looking at running dose assessment. So if there is a release from the plant, they're using computerized software to look at the meteorological data, the severity of the accident, what's actually being released, and then using that to project how much radiation is going to be released, how far it will go, and then what the radiation exposures will be at various points away from the power plant. It is also out of this Corporate Emergency Response Center that we manage and deploy our state field teams. Those field teams are going to go to our staging area. They're going to be equipped. They're going to be briefed. They're going to be provided with all the tools they need to go out into the field. And then they're going to take the samples, bring those back to the staging area where those samples will be received, managed, stored, and eventually analyzed. And I'll talk more about field teams in just a little bit, because that involves one of the opportunities that we're discussing today. So this is a picture of Dominion Energy's Corporate Emergency Response Center. As I said, you can view pretty much any system at the plant. This was during a presentation, so it doesn't show very well what you can see, but the 3 big boards in the front are broken up, and each of the panels on those boards can show different systems. So you can make it one big panel, or you can make individual little panels, each showing an individual point of data that you want to look at. To the left of the screen, the TVs that you see lined along the wall, that is their media center. So that is where they show or they come up with their public messaging. And then the different things along the floor are what different functions related to the plant. And I'm sorry, I just got a little bit confused there. So this is a picture of the circ. Mike, do you know why I cannot advance my slides now?
I don't know. I am seeing a little bit in the chat that there's, I guess some people are hearing you're coming in garbled. I'm hearing you perfectly loud and clear. I would suggest that if folks are having trouble hearing, that try turning off their camera, because that could be part of what's eating up bandwidth on their end. But WebExes are notoriously uneven, so it may be perfectly clear for 90% of the folks, and 10% of the folks here are garbled. So another thing you could do is leave and come back in if you really can't do anything about it.
Mike, let me know, did this advance the slide?
Yes, you're
Okay.
on Dominion Energy Circ slide 2.
Okay, good deal. So this is a picture of one of the dose assessment rooms at the Corporate Emergency Response Center. These rooms are where they conduct dose assessment, as it would indicate. This is also where they manage both the state and the Dominion or the corp or the utility field teams out of. There's a room specific for North Anna. There's also a room specific for Surrey. So there's individual rooms for each of the plants. What's unique about Dominion's Corporate Emergency Response Center is not only can they run response to both power plants in Virginia, but they can also run responses simultaneously to those two plants while also managing an events out of their facility in Connecticut and out of one of their facilities in South Carolina. So you can do a whole lot out of this one individual facility. And this is just, I'm sorry, this is just a picture of some slides from the State Emergency Response Center. These are old slides because a lot of the people that are in them are no longer here or have retired. So, but it just shows some of the action that goes on at the Emergency Response Center as they're managing an event. Again, these are just kind of for show. So I mentioned before what they do at the Emergency Operations Center is they come up with protective actions. And as I mentioned, the protective actions in a nuclear power plant incident are almost exclusively related to evacuation of individuals from the affected area. This slide shows what we call the standard protective action recommendation. This is actually put into place whenever the plant reaches a general emergency. And what you see on this slide is the little ring, the most innermost ring is a 2-mile circle around the power plant. The next ring out is 5 miles, and the next ring out from there is 10 miles. So that's the entire 10-mile EPZ. They separate the EPZ up into sectors, and each of those sectors are given a different number. A letter. And what you can see here is based on the wind direction, the standard par is that we do a 2-mile, 0 to 2 mile circle around the power plant, and then a 2-mile to 5 mile in the downwind affected sector, which given the wind direction, the downwind affected sector is E in this. And then the sectors on either side of that, so Delta and Foxtrot, are also included. So we use the 3 downwind sectors and then the 0 to 2 mile radial. So that's the standard par. That's the standard evacuation that's used in a power plant emergency. And then if there's a release, they start looking at what are the factors in the release, how severe is it, all the things I talked about before that we do in dose assessment. And if the dose assessment indicates that there's going to be an exceedance of any of the protective action guidelines, the PAGs, beyond the 2-mile radial that's already set up, then they can do an expansion of the protective action. And you can see that here in the slide to the right. So in the slide to the right, they have expanded the protective action out to 10 miles. So what they've done is instead of a 0 to 2 mile, now you have a 0 to 5 mile circle around each of the power plant. And then you have the 3 downwind sectors between 5 and 10 miles being evacuated. One thing that I'll mention is there's a proposed change to how this is being done. I won't go through that. But I will mention there's a potential change to this that will remove the 5-mile circle and limit the number of people that are actually going to be evacuated if there is an escalation. But again, this is just an example of one of the protective actions that they could take in response to an event. Within the 10-mile EPZ of each of the power plants, there are obviously the geographical area isn't divided into sectors, A, B, C, D, etc. But it is divided up geographically into what we call protective action zones. And these are the protective action zones around North Anna listed here. And you can see each one of those has a number. And what they do at the Emergency Operations Center is they take that, we call it a keyhole. So that image I showed on the previous slide, the colored in sections around the power plant and then the downwind sectors, and they apply that over the protective action zones. And here you can see the 10-mile EPZ map with the sectors superimposed over the PAZs. So what we do at the EOC is we look at where have we looked at an evacuation, the circles around the plant, and then the downwind sectors, and how does that affect the EPZs? Which of the EPZs are involved in that? And that's how they put the protective actions out to the public, is based on the PAZs that they live in. So when people are evacuated from within the 10-mile EPZ around each power plant, we know that a certain number of individuals are just going to self-evacuate on their own, and they're going to go to a hotel or to a relative's house or to something outside of the emergency planning zone. But for certain individuals, there are temporary shelters that are set up outside of the 10-mile EPZ in what we call host counties. And these are called evacuation assembly centers. And evacuation assembly centers, like I said, are temporary shelters that'll provide for basic needs. When individuals show up in an EAC, they actually screen both the vehicles and the individuals in the vehicles for radiological contamination. If there is evidence of contamination, then they can do decontamination at the facility. They can provide for basic medical attention. And one of the most important parts of the response that occurs at the emergency evacuation assembly centers is that is where they administer or give out doses of potassium iodide to the evacuees. If you don't know, potassium iodide is used to fight the effects of radioactive iodine that is released during a power plant event. So radioactive iodine likes to go and bind to the thyroid. By taking potassium iodide, i.e. we call it healthy iodine or just normal iodine, it'll actually bind up all the receptors in the thyroid and not allow the radioactive iodine to bind. And that's the idea behind taking it.
Hey, Matt, before you go on, we do have a couple of questions in the chat, and this might be a good stopping point to ask those.
Okay.
So one is, you mentioned that you can have radiation releases at different levels of emergency. And the question was, how often does that happen?
I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but for example, there has never been a GE in the United States. They've had site area emergencies. And I believe there's only a few of those, and probably the one that most people know the best is 3 Mile Island. There's been very few alerts. I mean, in terms of the number of power plants, and unusual events can get triggered by a lot of different things that aren't related to a degradation of the fission product barriers. And I'll give you an example of a fairly recent one. North Anna, if you've ever been up there, it's on a lake. A lot of people use the lake for recreation. And there is actually a recreational area at North Anna, and from the lake, it looks really nice. It's got basketball courts and picnic tables, and they even have a grill out there. And someone that was in a boat decided that looked like a good place to have a picnic. So they pulled their boat up and docked it and got out and walked out onto this recreational area that is also attached to the power plant. So security went there to confront the individuals, and so that drove the unusual event. What made it more interesting was the report said that the individual had a weapon. But what it turned out was he was cutting cheese and he had a knife to cut the cheese. And so when it all came said and done, it was all, an accident, but that drove an unusual event. No degradation of plant safety, no degradation of fission product barriers. But a lot of people got notified. Alerts can also occur with no degradation of the actual fission product barriers. An example of an alert, something that would drive an alert might be that you have a fire in a building that houses critical equipment, like pumps and stuff that pump coolant water. That would be something that would drive an alert. Again, there's no danger to the plant, but it's pushed it enough that if there was a failure past that, it could drive something that would affect the fission product barriers. But they do not occur very often. And I will say this, for the ones that everyone knows, Chernobyl and Fukushima, the conditions at those two plants and what drove those two accidents is above and beyond pretty much anything that any of us can imagine in the sake of Fukushima. And then at Chernobyl, it was completely driven by what they did to the reactor, not to they basically circumvented all the safety systems.
Yeah, so basically what you're saying is that actual releases of radiation into the environment are extremely rare.
Yes. And
Okay.
yeah, exactly. And they're not, and just if it makes people feel better, we actually sample around each of the power plants weekly. So we do water and air around each of the power plants weekly, at various sites. And then we also do soil, vegetation, fish, shellfish, and we have environmental dosimetry that we put out as well that we do at different frequencies. And we never find any fission products in those samples, other than tritium does get released into the water because you simply can't separate tritium from the water that's being released from the plant. But the tritium that is released is at very low levels, way below the action level for an environmental water source.
Okay, and then, one of the other questions in the chat is why do we not include Norfolk in this discussion because they've got nuclear submarines there? If you just want to briefly address that.
Yeah, so the Navy manages their incidents 100% on their own. What is unique about naval reactors is that they're much smaller than the commercial reactors. So the vast majority of the incidents that could occur at either of the two facilities never leave their controlled area. They never leave the actual boundaries of the base or the shipyard. There are a couple of wind directions that do affect a very small amount of area outside of that. We do partner with them. We do go to their drills. They do notify us when there's an event, but overall, the command and control of a event involving a nuclear reactor is 100% run by the individuals at that facility, with information being provided to the state.
Okay, and then just real quick, I know we're going to address this later in the presentation, but I just wanted to let you know this question's in there. It says it might be helpful to explain how MRC can assist in the plume phase or the ingestion recovery phase within the 50-mile EPZ. Without dosimetry, MRC volunteers would probably not be expected to go into the 10-mile EPZ, question mark. This is highly technical presentation regarding typical unplanned releases or medical consequences and prophylactic use of KI in the community. So yes to all, we will not send MRC volunteers into the hazard zone. So I just want to be clear. The opportunities that we're talking about are things that will support the response, but away from the designated hazard area. And we'll go into those specific response actions as we're continuing through the slide. So back over to you, Matt.
All right. And again, I do this just to give an idea about, because I don't know how much everybody knows about power plant incidents. So if you know a lot about it, this is boring. And if you don't know anything about it, maybe the pictures are nice to look at. So these are just some pictures I pulled off the internet for Evacuation Assembly Center. Again, not real important, just something to give an idea of what's going on and the type of actions that you might see there. So one thing that we do know, and a big gap that we have in response, is dealing with the public and their perception, understanding, and response to a radiological event or emergency. So we all know that people fear things they don't understand. And if you were in my job and you took some of the questions that I get from the public on a day-to-day basis, you would understand that people vastly do not understand things or vastly fear things they don't understand. And radiation is one thing that a lot of people don't understand. Radiation is an unseen threat. You can't see it, smell it, or taste it. So the only way that you know it's there is if you're carrying the equipment that tells you it's there. And so that creates a bit of a fear factor as well. I have this bullet point here: presence of contamination will escalate fear. What I mean by that is if you show up in an EAC and they screen your car, they screen your vehicle, your individual, or they screen, say, your children, and the meter starts beeping, that's going to raise that level of fear and anxiety because they're going to want to know, why is that occurring? What does that mean, etc. If you go through decontamination, that's going to be a loss of your possessions. They're going to take most of what you bring with you and put it in a bag and set it to the side because it's believed to be contaminated. If contamination on you or your family is high enough, they're actually going to take the clothes off of your back. Again, this is it's scary, it's very invasive, and so it involves a lot of things that raise fear and anxiety. Emergencies and evacuations are already extremely stressful without all these other factors that we talked about before. While there is some consideration given to pets in terms of evacuation and screening and decontamination, it may be that pets, and particularly livestock, have been left behind in an evacuation. Most people are going to have to abandon most or all of their possessions. And in the back of everyone's mind is, will they be able to return? So again, just kind of summing it up, few individuals who are being affected by this have even a basic understanding of radiation. And those that do, even basic radiation principles can be difficult to grasp. And so this was a gap that we knew. We knew a lot of people were going to have fear and anxiety following an evacuation order. But the question was, well, what do you do about that? And I'm going to go through these slides really quick, but these are the kind of things that based on my experience, people don't understand. So the first thing is most people don't know what is radiation. They don't know that radiation or radioactivity is essentially an unstable atom that wants to become more stable. They don't understand the principles behind that and what's going on. Sorry about that. They don't know the different types of radiation. And they don't understand that the different types of radiation have different health effects, different penetrating abilities, and travel different distances. But they may hear these terms being thrown around in the response that's going on around them. And that can be very scary. Again, if you don't know what's going on, you don't understand it, hearing the terminology can be somewhat scary. And again, if you don't know what's being talked about. Within our first responder community, this topic is not well understood always. So there's dose rate, which is the actual amount of radiation in a given area, and it's usually measured by unit of time. So when you're doing screening of an individual, usually it's in counts per minute or counts per second. But if you're taking environmental measurements, it's going to come up in units per hour, like MR per hour, REM per hour, etc. Most people don't understand how that relates to actual dose that the individual is exposed to. And so getting those two confused can be somewhat difficult. So someone may hear someone say that they screened at a certain counts per minute, but they have no idea what that means in actual physiological health effects to them or their family. The other thing that we find a lot is people don't understand the difference between exposure and contamination. I blame the Hulk for this. I honestly do. I think it's like people think that if you're exposed to radiation, you will forever carry the radiation with you. And that's not the case, but a lot of people do think that. And so that creates confusion, whereas the only type of radiation that goes with you is contamination, either internal or external. Exposure is exposure to the energy from the radioactive source, and when you are removed from that exposure, then the health effects to your person are then removed as well. And then this is something that most people who work in radiation and radiological fields understand the concepts of time, distance, and shielding. But not everyone understands that, and it goes both ways. A lot of people believe there's nothing that can protect you from radiation. They don't understand the effect that taking just a few steps back can have. And then there's people that go the opposite way, that think that because they were in their car, that gamma radiation wasn't able to get to them. And they don't understand that gamma radiation goes right through the car, right through you, right out the other side of the car and through the next 6 cars in line. So just misunderstandings about some of the stuff that is out there. And then all of this is tying into health effects. And I'm not going to go through all of this up there on the screen, but again, in the back of people's minds are, I'm going to die from this radiation. And there's a real belief that regardless of the dose that they got, that there's a non-recoverable health effect upon them or their families. And so these are just some slides that I use when I do training for first responders. Again, I'm just going to go through these really quick. But again, this is the kind of stuff that's in the back of people's minds. So this is getting to the actual role that we see for volunteers during an event. And what we would like to do is put together a deployable resource that evacuation assembly centers could request. And these would be support teams. And these support teams would be comprised of individuals, primarily individuals who have a background and an understanding of radiation, nuclear medicine, some sort of background or feeling of that, or have went through training to get that, who can provide evacuees with up-to-date information on the emergency and the protective action recommendations. So what has been done? What areas have been evacuated? Has potassium iodide been indicated or not? Those kind of things. These teams would also be able to answer basic radiation-related questions from members of the public. So things like, I came in and they screened me and my family and they said we were positive and had to be decontaminated, and what does that mean? Am I going to die? And was my family okay? Just being able to soothe and answer some basic questions for those individuals. One of the things that I believe once we get into the training for this, that we'll do is do a lot of work at tying radiation exposures back to known exposure events, things like x-rays, CAT scans, things that we get in a normal sense that people might be able to relate it to. So being able to say, well, the dose of radiation that you received is way less than what you would have gotten if you got a chest x-ray. That's a good way to allay someone's fears if they're really worried. But again, a lot of this is getting rid of that, or trying to get rid of the fear factor and give information to these individuals that have already been impacted by a very, very disruptive incident. Explaining the use of potassium iodide, what its mode of action is, why you're being given it, etc. As I said, general support of affected individuals, just answering questions, being there for them. And then the final part is, once deployed to the EAC, if there isn't the need for the primary mission, then these teams will be able to assist with and support other tasks at the evacuation assembly center upon request. So that's the idea that we put together for the teams.
Hey, Matt.
Yeah, Mike.
Hey, yeah. So that's team one, is the EAC support team. And I know we have a lot of questions that have built up in the chat. I don't know if you can see them with the slideshow running, Matt.
Like they pop up really quick and then they're gone really quick, so I can't.
Okay. Yeah, so you can't answer them directly while you're talking. That's okay. I think a lot of these things you've already gone into. One of the questions is, if you're involved in this team, how will you be deployed? So we will use the VVHS system. to request specific volunteers that are trained for these missions, that have agreed to come to these missions and have completed the training, which we'll tell you about later in the presentation, how you can complete the training and how you can sign up for Team A, for this team, the EAC support team, or the other team that we're going to talk about in just a minute. But once you're involved in that team and we've got you trained, if we needed to deploy you, we would send that through the VVHS system. And then you would get a text to your cell phone or an email as well. Some question about radiation giving you a metallic taste in your mouth, and Matt, you can answer that if that's true or if that's a myth.
I've never seen that anywhere in any of the classes that I've taken on radiation, and radiation exposure. The most of the time when people have symptoms that they can detect, they're the nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, the things that are general. And then at the really high exposures, they get some pretty severe symptoms. But for the most part, other than nausea and vomiting and diarrhea that can come on at various points after exposure, you don't really hear about a lot of symptoms. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen. I just haven't heard about it a
Yeah.
lot. And the truth of the matter is, we don't have a great amount of information, because a lot of what we learned about the physiological effects on people to high exposures of radiation came from accidental exposures, where we then studied those individuals following that accidental exposure. For example, individuals involved in the making of the atomic bombs, they had a couple of criticality incidents where people took crazy high doses, and then they looked at what was the effect on those individuals. So our knowledge isn't that great in it, but I've never heard that, but it doesn't mean that it couldn't occur.
Yeah, and I want to touch. There's a question about pets. So, the evacuation assembly centers will, if you bring your pet, they will let you in with your pet. Now there may be restrictions, like if you've got, a pet alligator or something, but if you got your dog or cat, they'll screen you through, and they'll, check your pet for radiation, and if necessary, go through decontamination. But where people may not have their pet is if, they're already outside the evacuated area. We're not going to let them back in necessarily just to get their pet. So that may be an issue there. So not everybody will be able to evacuate with their pet for that reason.
Yep. Did you want me to speak more to that, or?
No, I think we got it covered. I think you can go on. If we get some more questions, I'll stop you again.
Okay. Just for edification of everyone. So the way that they actually help, they did this a few years ago. One of the hazmat guys out of Newport News actually had a former bomb dog that he had rescued, or not rescued, but had adopted. And so we actually brought her to one of the EACs, and had everyone, had the monitoring teams monitor her for contamination. And then they did some mock decontamination, and she knew certain hand signals. So to make it difficult on them, like when they would screen her rear, he'd have her sit, or he'd have her go in circles when they were trying to screen her, just to mess with them. And again, because we know that not all animals are going to be well behaved. And they've also brought up some ideas of, again, like Mike mentioned, what if someone shows up with their pet snake? How are we going to deal with this? What are we going to do? So they do have protocols in place for pets, but the definition of pet does seem to vary quite a bit. So getting back to the presentation, these are just some basic knowledge, skills, and abilities that I put together for the EAC support teams. This is not all inclusive. This is just something I kind of came up with as I was putting this together. But it's the ability to maintain situational awareness. And that doesn't mean you have to do that on your own. It means knowing where to go to get the information, understanding the basic response structure at the EAC, and how to go about getting the information you need to provide to the evacuees. So things like, what are the current protective actions? What areas have been evacuated? Is there a release ongoing or not? I'll give you an example. People will be evacuated even before there's a release. If there's no release and you know that, then you can tell them, yes, you've been evacuated, but there's no radiological danger to you because no radiation has left the plant. There is no release. That's a very important thing for people to know if they've been affected by this. It's important that you be able to know and provide information on the protective actions. So these folks might have been told, for example, we have a type of event called a hostile action based. And in a hostile action based event, a lot of times the recommendation is to shelter in place, not evacuate. And then later on, they may be evacuated. So there may be questions. Why was I told to stay in my home and now I'm being told to leave? So explaining that and why it was done, explaining why they're being given potassium iodide or vice versa. Why am I not being given potassium iodide? And it can be, you can indicate to them why that's occurring. And again, this will come through the training that we'll do. And then again, being able to explain some complex radiological principles in some simple terms. And I talked before about maybe being able to relate something to a more common or a more well-known radiological or radiation exposure. So walking them through that, and then just a general knowledge of EAC operations. And moving on from that, I mentioned before about the staging area and the field teams. And I just highlighted in red that here. This is from the previous slide that I showed. So we have state field monitoring teams, and I kind of broke down on this slide what state field monitoring teams are and what they do. So our state field monitoring teams are comprised of actually regional hazardous materials team members. So these are VDEM managed hazardous materials teams across the state. And we bring them in and they staff our field teams. They're deployed in specially equipped state vehicles. They wear, after there's a release, they wear full PPE. So that for them includes Tyvek suits, gloves, booties, respiratory protection, and then they tape up and everything, all the seals and the connection points. Their assignment is to go in and find the center line of any plume that's leaving the plant. So the center line is the area of highest concentration. So somewhat contrary to what most people are doing, these guys are going in and trying to find the center line, the most highly contaminated area of the plume. Inside of that plume, they're going to monitor radiation levels, and then they're going to be asked to collect air samples. We know radiation exposure to these teams is expected. They are given dosimetry, and then they're given dose-based turn back, or reporting, turn back, protecting valuable property, life-saving, and then voluntary life-saving dose limits. We know these teams are going to get highly contaminated. It is expected. They report all the information they gather back to Office of Radiological Health personnel, and most important to these teams at all times is procedural adherence. If they go off a procedure, everything kind of falls apart. And that's how we train during exercises, is 100% procedural adherence. So the second role that we came up with, the second opportunity for volunteer involvement, involves what, and I may not have used the right terminology. Mike had a great name for the teams, and I think it was non-plume teams, but if not, Mike can tell you the great name that he came up with. But essentially, it's for non-plume monitoring teams. So these teams would be comprised of volunteers that would deploy in personal vehicles, utilizing equipment, dosimetry, and PPE provided by the state. This would not include respiratory protection. They would perform radiation monitoring along the periphery of the evacuated areas. So this is, again, not going into the center line of the plume. This is confirming that the protective actions that are in place are adequate, that the areas that we've labeled as clean, i.e. no radiation, are in fact clean. And so if the idea being that if you confirm that, that's great. That's data that we need. If you run into radiation in an area where we shouldn't or don't believe it is there, that's even better data. These teams would get strict dose rate-based turnback limits. So not dose, because we don't want these teams to accumulate dose. we would give strict dose rate based turnbacks. So again, a reading on the meter would drive your turnback. Same way as the state teams, they report all their readings back to Office Radiological Health personnel. We may actually ask these teams to collect air samples because we can take the filters and the cartridges out of those air samples back to our mobile lab and do some pretty in-depth analysis looking at extremely low levels of radiation in those samples, lower than the meters would actually pick up. But again, for these teams, just like for a state team, the most important thing at all times would be procedural adherence, and you'd be provided with a procedure. And then before ever being deployed as part of one of these teams, you'd be given training on that procedure and actually physically doing all the steps.
Hey, Matt, I'm just going to jump in because a question came up. So, just to be clear, the state field teams that go into the axis of the plume will not consist of volunteers. So the volunteer role would be limited to these non-plume zone response teams. So the goal is to go to areas that, according to all of the science and predictions that we have, should not be contaminated. And normally we wouldn't do anything with those areas, but this will allow us just to go and send people to those specific areas and let us know that, yes, these are still safe. So volunteers aren't going into a plume. However, we can't guarantee that there won't be any radiation, but Matt's going to talk about what we're doing to mitigate that risk as well.
Yep, exactly. Thanks, Mike. So just like I did for the previous thing, I tried to come up with some knowledge, skills, and abilities. And I think I failed miserably at this because a lot of these aren't knowledge, skills, and abilities. They're more things, but bear with me. So things that you would need to be a member of the team, you'd need transportation to some point, so personal vehicle. I will tell you that I have total 2 vehicles that I deploy state field teams in. That's the extent of the vehicles that belong to my program. So I don't have vehicles to put volunteers in. And then there's also an issue with we can't put members of the public in a state vehicle. Obviously, you need to be able to drive a vehicle if you're going to drive it, and you need to be able to do that legally. We will give you monitoring points within each of those zones that I showed around the plant. There are monitoring points within each of those alphabetical pie slices, if you will, that are around the plants. And there's different monitoring points. We can give you those by coordinates. GPS coordinates, and you can plug them into the GPS. However, one thing that we do have to be careful with the volunteer teams is we have to make sure that the route that the GPS is going to take you doesn't actually drive you through the plume to get to your monitoring point. And that would be something where you might be deployed to the far side of the plume to confirm, again, background. And so you may end up driving all the way around that circle versus going in a more straight route. So the ability to use paper map and follow direction would be important. You need to have a basic understanding of radiation measurement principles. Now, I will say that even for the hazardous materials technicians on the state teams, the way you report the readings is you read exactly what's on the face of the meter. So if it says 30 UR per hour, that's exactly what they read. They don't use the terminology of micro and millirem because those M words get confused. And that has happened several times and caused, not in this world, but in other types of response, and caused some pretty big problems. So again, it's just understanding how to read the face of the meter and how to communicate that. You need to have effective communication skills, be able to be clear and concise, and also take direction. And then the ability to deploy with 1 to 2 others and work effectively as a team. The reason we say this is even on the state field teams, there's 3 people. So they actually have one person that their entire job is to read the procedure and make sure that everyone else adheres to the procedure. We have another person that actually does all the physical work, taking the measurements, taking the air samples, setting up the equipment. And then we have a third individual in our teams that does nothing but fill out forms and talk on the radio. So that's the makeup of the state teams. The volunteer teams would probably be 2-person teams with one person charged with actually taking the readings, actually acting out the various steps in the procedure, and then the other person reading off the procedure and then recording and communicating the results of any work that's done. And again, like I said before, procedural adherence. You got to be able to stick to the procedure and not go rogue on us, because that's happened with our state field teams before. And then I'm just going to run through these really quick. So regardless of the type of field team you are, you will be deployed to a staging area. Our staging areas are actually VDOT residencies. So we have different VDOT residencies around the different power plant emergency planning zones. So you'd be deployed to that staging area, where you would get briefings and various equipment. And some of that equipment and supplies are listed on this slide. This is what our staging area is. It's our mobile incident command laboratory vehicle. This lab has all the equipment in it that we need to analyze the samples, as well as all the stuff that we're going to send field teams out with. It's all transported in this vehicle that goes to the staging area. You'll get dosimetry. So you'll get both a digitally alarming dosimeter, which is the two devices to the left-hand side of the screen. You'll also be given an OSLD, which is the small little tag looking thing on the upper right. And then every member of the field team will get potassium iodide as well. You'll get a whole list of different supplies, and understand that it's really hard to read this here. It's not important that you see everything that's on there. This is actually the list for the state field teams. The list of equipment given to the volunteer teams would be a little bit less than this. But again, you'd be given a list of supplies. You'd be expected to go through that list of supplies, check off that everything is there that you need and that everything is functioning properly. Again, all this is driven by your procedure. For people who are somewhat knowledgeable on equipment, this is the current meters that we're using. So we use the Ludlam Model 3001s. I'll reserve my comments on how much I like these compared to what we used to have, but this is what we're using now. So this is what you'd be deployed with in terms of detection equipment. And then you go out and be asked to do take measurements. Now, these are the measurement directions that we give to the state field teams. Again, because we know they're going to be in the plume, and we want to get a determination of where is the plume. Is it elevated? Is it all ground deposition, or are they actually immersed in the plume? For the volunteer teams, it'll probably be more simplistic of just taking open window readings, probably in the vehicle, because there's no reason to get out of the vehicle, again, because we know if there is any gamma radiation, it will actually go through the vehicle and be able to be detected inside. As I said, you may be asked to take an air sample. Again, procedure would drive how do you do that? What are the steps that you would take? And then this next slide just shows a breakdown, a little bit more sophisticated breakdown of the air sampling equipment. We use this when we're training field teams to show them how to put together the air sampler, how to break it down, what the different parts are, etc. And then you would finally, after taking an air sample, bring the filter paper and the cartridge, which is the picture at the lower right-hand side in the Ziploc bags, back to the lab for analysis if you were actually directed to take those. And that's all that I have. Here's my contact information. And then Susan Binkley works in my division, and she is another person that you can reach out to for questions related to our division and our emergency preparedness activities. And that's all that I had in terms of a presentation. So I'll turn it back over to whoever else wants to put stuff on the screen.
Hey, Matt.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, real quick, we had a couple of questions. I think you've probably already answered them pretty well, but just to verify, so the non-plume zone teams, before you ever deploy, as part of this team, there will be hands-on training where we'll go very much in depth on each of those pieces of equipment and how to use them, and how to use them correctly, and how to know what to do when certain things happen and if alarm goes off. So we didn't get too deep into this because this was really just an interest meeting, and there will be like a more in-depth hands-on training. So don't feel like if you didn't jot down everything Matt said today that you're going to get deployed tomorrow to a radiation zone and you're not going to have any training. So I just want to
No,
be clear. Yeah.
no, and I will say, we still have some things to iron out in terms of how we're going to deploy the teams, and um, we have to make some decisions about things like access, because you may actually drive through an area that's been evacuated, and so we have to make sure that the law enforcement charged with not letting people back in there understand that your role and your mission. Um, so things like that may be important.